The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the county courthouse, spilling thin golden light across the marble floors. The building itself was old, its walls echoing decades of trials, verdicts, and whispered stories of justice. People were filing into courtroom 6B, their steps hurried, their voices hushed, their faces drawn with the curiosity and tension that always surrounded a high-profile trial. Reporters stood at the entrance, flipping through notepads and checking their recorders, waiting for the kind of headline moments they lived for. Inside, the air was heavy thick with expectation. Every creak of the wooden benches, every shuffle of papers from the attorneys' tables, seemed louder than usual, almost amplified by the silence of anticipation. The trial in question wasn't just another case. It carried weight. The defendant, a man in his 40s with a stern, cold expression, sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly, his eyes flicking from the judge's bench to the jury box. He had been the subject of countless whispers around town, his name spoken with suspicion and fear. Today was meant to be decisive. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, had not yet entered the room. Still, everyone sat straighter, lowering their voices as though his presence already lingered. The bailiff, tall and stoic, stood near the doorway, ensuring order. At the prosecution's table, two lawyers whispered to each other, flipping through files, adjusting their suits, their movements brisk and precise. The defense attorney, by contrast, leaned back slightly, his jaw tight, his eyes betraying the weight of the day ahead. In the midst of this solemn gathering, however, one figure seemed completely out of place, a little girl, no more than 3 years old, sitting on a bench at the back of the courtroom with her mother. She had soft curls that framed her tiny face and wide, curious eyes that seemed too innocent for the room she was in. Her mother, dressed in a plain blouse and skirt, kept whispering for her to sit still, gently bouncing her on her lap to keep her entertained. The girl's legs swung back and forth, her small shoes tapping against the wooden bench. No one paid much attention to her at first. After all, children didn't usually belong in courtrooms, and if they were present, they were considered little more than a distraction. Most assumed the woman was here as a witness or supporter, with no one suspecting the child would have any role in what was about to unfold. She was just another face in a crowd filled with tension, lawyers, jurors, and reporters waiting for the trial to resume. But the girl wasn't focused on the people around her. She wasn't staring at the judge's bench or at the defendant whose future hung in the balance. Her gaze was locked on to something else entirely, the police dog sitting obediently near, its handler at the side of the courtroom. The dog was a German shepherd, large but controlled, its posture perfect, its eyes watchful. It wore its harness proudly, the badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. To most, the K9 was just part of the scenery, there to represent law and order, a silent reminder of the seriousness of the case. To the girl, however, it was something else altogether. She stared at it with a mixture of recognition and delight, her little hands twitching as if she wanted to reach out and touch it. The mother noticed, giving her daughter's arm a light. "Squeeze. She whispered. "Sit still, sweetheart. We need to be quiet." But the girl couldn't tear her eyes away. The dog's calm presence seemed to draw her in. Every time it shifted, adjusting its position slightly beside the officer, she followed the movement with keen attention, almost as though she knew it. A reporter sitting nearby caught the little girl's expression and smiled faintly, scribbling in his notebook, assuming she was simply fascinated by the impressive animal. Others around them barely noticed. Courtrooms were filled with distractions, coughs, shuffling papers, the occasional dropped pen, but nothing prepared anyone for what was about to happen. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance. Everyone rose to their feet, the wooden benches groaning under the weight of the movement. The judge walked in with authority, his robe swaying slightly as he took his place at the bench. "You may be seated," he said firmly, and the trial was officially back in session. The attorneys began their opening remarks for the day. Words about evidence, timelines, witness credibility filled the air. Some jurors leaned forward, taking careful notes, while others sat back, their expressions guarded, trying not to betray any thought. The defendant sat still, his jaw tightening with each word spoken against him. The dog remained calm, silent, its loyalty anchored to its handler. At the back of the room, the little girl shifted on her mother's lap. She whispered softly, "Doggy." Her voice was innocent, quiet, but just loud enough for her mother to hush her again, pressing a finger to her lips. Still, the child wriggled, her eyes locked on the shepherd as though she saw something nobody else did. As the morning wore on, the courtroom's energy grew heavier. Lawyers presented motions, witnesses prepared to testify, and the judge maintained order with steady authority. But the little girl was restless, tugging at her mother's sleeve, pointing again and again toward the canine. Her mother, embarrassed, tried to distract her with a small toy she had tucked in her bag, but it was useless. The child's attention refused to waver. The officer holding the dog noticed eventually. His eyes flicked toward the girl, curious at her unwavering stare. Children were often drawn to Canine South. They were impressive animals, but there was something in the intensity of her gaze that unsettled him. He brushed it off, focusing again on the proceedings, unaware of the storm about to break. For now, it was still just a normal morning in the courtroom. Papers shuffled. Testimonies began. The jurors listened. The dog sat. The child watched. But in that stillness lay the seed of something extraordinary, a moment no one in the room could anticipate. The trial, for all its seriousness and carefully laid plans, was about to be interrupted by innocence, a child's voice, piercing the walls of law and order with a truth so simple it would shock everyone present. And it all began with the unblinking gaze of a 3-year-old girl who couldn't take her eyes off a dog. A German shepherd sat poised at the front of the courtroom, a striking figure of discipline and control. Its fur gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a mix of sable and black that shimmered whenever it shifted slightly on the polished wooden floor. Though the room was packed with people, lawyers, jurors, the defendant, spectators, the animal was unmoved by the noise and tension surrounding it. Its amber eyes scanned the courtroom with steady focus, never lingering too long on one person, yet missing nothing. This dog was no ordinary companion. He was a K9, a decorated member of the police force, trained to detect danger, follow commands instantly, and protect his handler at all costs. The officer holding the leash stood tall beside him, uniform crisp, every movement deliberate. 2. Most in the room. The pair represented security, a living reminder that the law reached beyond paper and gavel into loyalty, muscle, and instinct. For many of the courtroom's occupants, however, the dog was little more than background. The jury, seated attentively in their box, kept their eyes trained on the attorneys as they sparred over legal motions. The defendant's lawyer flipped through a thick binder of notes, glancing occasionally toward his client, who sat rigidly, lips pressed in a thin line. Even the judge, perched above them all, regarded the shepherd as a formality rather than a presence. But not everyone saw it that way. At the back of the room, the 3-year-old girl who had been restless during the morning session was still, fixated on the dog. Her tiny hands clutched the wooden railing in front of her bench, her knuckles turning white with effort. She leaned forward as far as her mother's arm would allow, her wide eyes never leaving the shepherd. To her, the dog wasn't a symbol or a formality. He wasn't even just a doggy that children naturally admired. There was recognition in her gaze, something sharper than simple fascination. Her mother noticed the intensity, tugging her, gently back into her seat. "Sweetheart, sit still," she whispered urgently. "This isn't the place." But the girl squirmed again, eyes still locked on the animal. The officer caught her movement from the corner of his eye. His brow furrowed briefly. It wasn't unusual for children to stare at the dog. The shepherd had a commanding presence that drew attention wherever he went. Still, this little one's focus felt different. She wasn't smiling like most children did when they saw him. She wasn't giggling or bouncing in her seat out of excitement. Instead, she looked serious, as if she knew something others didn't. The officer shifted his stance, giving the leash a subtle tug. The dog responded immediately. Sitting taller, ears perked. Its tail brushed lightly against the floor once, then stilled. A handler glanced back at the attorneys, who were still deep in their motions. The court reporter's machine clacked rhythmically as she typed. Nobody else seemed aware of the silent exchange happening between the child and the animal. Shepard's presence wasn't an accident. He had been brought here because the case at hand carried not only emotional weight, but also the threat of danger. Rumors had swirled about potential outbursts, about supporters of the defendant trying to disrupt proceedings. The judge had allowed the dog's presence as both a comfort to victims and a deterrent against chaos. Still, as far as anyone was concerned, he was little more than a precaution insurance that would likely never be called upon. The girl's mother sighed, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Please, just watch quietly," she murmured. But the child shook her head, her eyes still wide. "I know him," she whispered softly. The words were barely audible, lost under the hum of legal arguments, but they sent a chill through her mother nonetheless. Know him? How could she know him? She glanced at the dog again, then at her daughter, dismissing the thought as imagination. Children often claimed to know animals. They gave them names, invented stories, built entire worlds around them. Surely this was no different. Yet the little girl remained steadfast, her lips pressing together in concentration. To her, the shepherd was no stranger. His posture, the tilt of his ears, the way his eyes flickered across the room, it all seemed familiar. Minutes ticked by. The courtroom droned on with legal jargon that meant little to anyone outside the attorneys and judge. Jurors tried to stay alert, shifting in their seats as fatigue threatened to dull their attention. The defendant stared at the table in front of him, refusing to meet the gaze of the jury. The reporters tapped quietly on their laptops, trying to capture the dryness of legal motions into words that would matter to readers. And through it all, the shepherd remained vigilant. He was more than a symbol of security. His nose twitched faintly at certain scents. His ears flicked toward subtle sounds no human noticed. His body tensed at shifts in energy within the room. A stranger clearing his throat 3 rows back, a chair scraping against the floor. A whispered commented all registered with him, filed away as background or potential threat. This was his job. This was his life. And then, once again, he met the girl's gaze. For a brief moment, his head tilted ever so slightly, ears forward, as though he too recognized something. His handler felt the shift and gave a soft command. Under his breath, the shepherd straightened immediately, posture resuming its disciplined stillness. But the flicker of recognition had not gone unnoticed, not by the child, at least. She smiled faintly, her little fingers tapping against the bench as though she were waiting for him to respond again. Her mother exhaled sharply. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice a mix of worry and embarrassment. "You'll get us thrown out." The child pouted, but didn't look away. Something inside her told her the dog knew her just as much as she knew him. She couldn't explain it, not at her age, but the certainty burned bright in her chest. The judge's gavel struck sharply, pulling everyone back to the proceedings. "Motion sustained," he declared, his voice booming through the room. Papers rustled, attorneys shifted strategies. The trial moved forward. But at the back of the courtroom, in the space between innocence and truth, something much bigger was brewing. The German shepherd remained still, but his eyes softened whenever they fell on the little girl. And she, refusing to look anywhere else, clung to the invisible thread of recognition, pulling her toward him. For everyone else, the dog was simply part of the scenery. For her, he was the center of everything. And soon, everyone in that room would understand why. The courtroom carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. Attorneys volleyed legal jargon across the room. The court reporter's keys clicked steadily, and the judge leaned forward, listening intently. Yet in the back row, where a 3-year-old sat wriggling restlessly on her mother's lap, an entirely different energy was unfolding, one that nobody was paying attention to, at least not yet. The girl had been fighting her mother's gentle restraint for nearly half an hour. She wanted to move closer. She wanted to reach the German shepherd. Every fiber of her little body buzzed with recognition, a pull she didn't understand but could not resist. Her mother's patience was wearing thin. She stroked her daughter's hair, whispered promises of a treat if she stayed still, even offered her a small crayon and paper from her purse. But nothing distracted the child. Her gaze, intense and unshakable, remained fixed on the dog. The shepherd had noticed her again. His handler, sensing a shift, gave the leash a faint tug to redirect his focus. But the animal's instincts were sharper than his training at that moment. His ears flicked forward, his chest expanded with a deep, quiet breath, and his eyes locked with the little girl's. That was when it happened. The girl pushed against her mother's arm, pointing her tiny finger toward the dog with the urgency only a child could express. "Doggy!" she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to ripple through the courtroom. Dozens of heads turned. For a split second, the silence was palpable. Even the judge's brows rose slightly, his stern face breaking into a moment of human curiosity. The lawyers at the front table paused mid-sentence, their voices halting like a train derailed from its tracks. Her mother flushed red, pulling her daughter close, whispering in embarrassed, "She not know." But it was too late. The sound had pierced the solemnity of the proceedings, like a pebble thrown into still water. Some spectators chuckled softly. A reporter raised his eyebrows, scribbling a note, perhaps seeing the humor in a child's interruption. Others frowned, annoyed at the disturbance. But the officer holding the shepherd stiffened. Something about the girl's exclamation felt off, not in tone, but in intensity. This wasn't simple childish enthusiasm. Her voice carried certainty. The judge cleared his throat. "Please, let us continue," he said, trying to smooth the disruption. His gavel tapped once, gently this time. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances before resuming. But the little girl wasn't finished. She leaned forward again, pointing with even more determination. Her mother tried to hush her, whispering desperately, "Sweetheart, you have to be quiet. This isn't the place." But the child shook her head, eyes glistening with recognition. Then, in a voice small yet startlingly clear, she spoke words that froze the air. "Max, sit." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The German shepherd, without hesitation, obeyed. He dropped into a perfect sit, his tail wagging with sudden energy, his eyes fixed adoringly on the little girl. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reporters leaned forward, pens scribbling furiously. Even the judge, usually unflappable, leaned back in his chair, his gavel hovering as though he wasn't sure whether to demand silence or let the moment play out. The officer stared at his partner in disbelief. That was not the command name he had been using for years. In fact, the dog's name had been changed long ago when he joined the force. Max was his name from training days, a name almost no one outside the unit knew anymore. How could a toddler possibly know it? The handler's heart thumped against his chest. His partner hadn't responded so eagerly to anyone outside his circle of trainers and officers. Yet here he was, tail wagging, body vibrating with joy at the sound of his old name spoken by a little girl he shouldn't have remembered. The defendant's reaction was the most telling of all. He shifted in his seat, his once stoic mask cracking. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted toward the child. Then away again, as if the walls of the courtroom were suddenly closing in on him. The mother's eyes widened in horror. She clutched her daughter tightly, whispering urgently, "Where did you hear that? How do you know that name?" Her voice trembled with fear, not anger. The child, confused by the sudden tension, frowned. Slightly. "That's Max," she said simply, her voice pure, without hesitation. "He's my friend." The shepherd barked once, not loudly but firmly, almost as though confirming her words. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge finally struck his gavel down hard. "Order," he commanded, his voice booming. "This is a court of law. Control yourselves." Yet even as he spoke, his own eyes betrayed his curiosity. He turned his gaze toward the officer, silently demanding an explanation. But the officer had none. His mind raced. Had the dog encountered this girl before? In what context? How could she possibly know his former command name? The prosecution team exchanged electrified glances, sensing opportunity. The defense attorney, on the other hand, paled visibly, his hand tightening on his pen until it snapped with a sharp crack. Meanwhile, the little girl, oblivious to the ripple effect of her innocent words, smiled brightly, her fingers still pointing. "Max is a good dog," she said, her voice lilting, almost like a song. The handler swallowed hard, gripping the leash tighter, but the shepherd didn't move. His attention was no longer on the officer, or even the defendant. It was solely on the child, his body language radiating recognition and affection. The judge rubbed his temple, sighing. "We will take a short recess," he declared, his voice carrying both authority and weariness. 5 minutes. He struck the gavel again, and the room buzzed into chaos. Lawyers clustered in huddles, whispering urgently. Reporters rushed to file quick notes, some already reaching for their phones to send messages out of the room. Spectators leaned toward each other, trading theories and wild speculation. At the center of it all, the little girl giggled, swinging her legs against the bench, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. Her mother's hands shook as she adjusted her daughter's dress and whispered again, "How do you know him? Tell me right now." The girl's answer was simple, almost frustrating in its innocence. "Because Max came to our house," she said softly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Her mother's breath caught. The officer's eyes widened. And across the room, the defendant pressed his palms against the table, his knuckles turning white, his composure unraveling. By the second, the courtroom was no longer a place of routine motions and predictable testimonies. It had become a theater of revelation, all sparked by a toddler's voice and a dog's instinctive response. No one could have predicted it. No one could yet comprehend its full meaning. But one thing was certain. This trial had just taken a turn that would change everything. The courtroom, usually a place of measured words and deliberate procedure, had erupted into a storm of whispers. The sound was unlike anything the judge had experienced in years a low, rising buzz of disbelief, shock, and restless curiosity. Even his gavel, slammed twice in frustration, couldn't completely restore the silence. Something extraordinary had just happened, and everyone in the room knew it. The little girl's voice still lingered in the air. "Max, sit!" And the dog this highly trained, disciplined police K9 had obeyed. Instantly, without hesitation. without looking to his handler for confirmation. He had responded directly to the child, as though she were his rightful commander. The girl beamed with satisfaction, clapping her tiny hands as if she'd accomplished a magic trick. To her, it was simple. She knew the dog. She called his name, and he listened. To the rest of the courtroom, it was unfathomable. The officer holding the leash stood frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the strap. His mind raced back to training days, to the early months when this German shepherd was still being conditioned to respond to commands. Back then, he had been Max. That name had been used during drills, exercises, and bonding sessions. But when he joined active service, his call name was changed for confidentiality and tactical reasons. Only the handlers who had worked closely with him would know his old name. And yet, this 3-year-old child had spoken it with perfect clarity. The officer's pulse hammered in his temples. He could feel dozens of eyes drilling into him, demanding an explanation he couldn't give. The dog wagged his tail happily, his tongue lolling, utterly at ease with the child's presence. To him, there was no courtroom, no trial, no tension only. Recognition, reunion, and loyalty. At the defense table, the defendant's reaction was impossible to miss. His face had drained of color, his lips pressed so tightly together they seemed bloodless. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding the juror's gaze, avoiding the dog, avoiding the child. For the first time since the trial began, the mask of confidence had slipped. The jurors noticed. Everyone noticed. The defense attorney sensing. The shift leaned toward his client and whispered urgently, his words sharp and rapid. The defendant shook his head faintly, refusing to respond, his shoulders rigid. Across the room, the prosecution sat straighter. Their eyes gleamed with a mix of surprise and opportunity. They hadn't planned for this. Nobody had, but they recognized the significance. If the child had prior knowledge of the dog's identity, it suggested she had been present during moments central to the case. Her words weren't simply the innocent outburst of a toddler. They were a thread one that, if pulled, could unravel the defense's carefully constructed narrative. The judge leaned forward, his gavel still in hand, though his grip had loosened. He peered over his glasses at the handler. "Officer," he said slowly, his voice measured. "Was that the dog's name?" The officer cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing. He hesitated, torn between confidentiality and honesty. Finally, he nodded once, curtly. "It was, Your Honor." During early training, a collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed. And how would a child of 3 years come to know it? No one answered. Not. Yet, the little girl swung her legs cheerfully, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. She leaned closer to her mother, whispering loudly enough for the nearby Rose to hear. "I told you, Mommy. That's Max. He remembers me." The officer felt the dog tug gently at the leash, trying to edge closer to the child. He tightened his hold, whispering a command under his breath. The shepherd froze, but his eyes never left the girl. The murmurs grew louder again. Spectators whispered theories. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The judge slammed his gavel down hard this time. "Order in." The court. His voice boomed, silencing most, though the shock still vibrated in the air. Turning to the girl's mother, the judge asked, "Ma'am, can you explain your daughter's words?" The woman's face flushed crimson. Her hands shook as she pulled her daughter onto her lap, hugging her tightly. I don't know, Your Honor," she stammered. "She's just a child. Sometimes she says things. She makes things up." "She didn't make this up," the officer interrupted before he could stop himself. His voice rang across the room, startling even his own ears. That name. No one outside the unit knows it. The mother's lips parted, but no words came. She looked down at her daughter, whose innocent smile contrasted painfully with the gravity of the moment. "Max is a good dog," the child said proudly, patting her mother's arm. The judge's gaze sharpened. He saw it now, the shift in energy, the defendant's unraveling composure, the prosecution's alertness. Something had cracked open. This was no ordinary outburst. "Counselors," he said firmly, addressing both tables, "I will allow a brief recess. When we reconvene, we will address what just occurred." His gavel struck once more, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. The prosecution leaned into a tight huddle, their whispers urgent and excited. The defense attorney barked at his client. In hushed tones, his hands gesturing wildly, his face taut with panic. Reporters bolted for the doors, eager to be the first to break the story of the courtroom bombshell. The officer knelt beside his dog, his hand pressed against the shepherd's neck. "What's going on, partner?" he murmured under his breath, his eyes flicking to the girl. The dog whined softly, ears pinned back, as though frustrated at being held back from someone he recognized. The little girl, blissfully unaware of the storm she had unleashed, reached for her mother's necklace and giggled. "He wants to." "Come here," she said, matter of fact, her small voice carrying despite the noise. Her mother buried her face in her hands, trembling. She knew, deep down, that her daughter's words meant more than she wanted to admit. Memories she had tried to suppress clawed their way back, memories tied to the man sitting at the defense table, to the house where fear had once lived, to the day when a barking dog had filled their world with both terror and hope. The defendant shifted again, sweat beating at his temples. He knew the walls were closing in. The dog's name, the child's recognition, his own reaction, every piece was tightening the noose around him. The recess bell rang, and the judge rose from the bench. "We will reconvene in 10 minutes, he declared, his voice stern. "Court is adjourned until then." As people filed out, the air buzzed with speculation. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered that fate itself had intervened. But for those who understood, who pieced together the fragments of truth, one thing was clear. The trial was no longer about what the lawyers could prove. It was about what a child had seen, what a dog remembered, and the fragile line between innocence and justice. And it had all begun with two simple words that shattered the courtroom's composure and left everyone wondering what the little girl would say next. When the gavel fell again, signaling the end of recess, the tension inside the courtroom hadn't eased, it had only thickened. Every person who re-entered carried with them an urgency, as though they were returning not to a trial, but to the scene of a revelation that could shift everything. The whispers had followed them down the hallways, into bathrooms, even into the marble foyer. The little girl knew the dog's name. Now, as the judge reclaimed his seat, silence blanketed the room. Jurors leaned forward, pens poised, their eyes sharp and alert. Reporters gripped their notepads, hungry for the next explosion. Even the air felt heavy, as though everyone were bracing for the weight of truth. The officer with the canine sat rigidly on the witness bench, one hand resting firmly on the leash. The German shepherd sat obediently, but his eyes remained fixed on the small child sitting beside her mother in the gallery. Every now and then, his tail brushed the floor with a soft thump, betraying his eagerness to close the distance between them. The judge cleared his throat. "We will resume proceedings," he said firmly, scanning the room. "Before we continue with scheduled testimony, I find it necessary to address the incident involving the child and the police canine." All eyes turned to the girl, who now swung her legs gently beneath her chair. She was the only one seemingly unaffected by the gravity pressing down on the courtroom. Her small hands clutched a stuffed bunny, its ears worn from love. She hugged it to her chest, oblivious to the fact that the world awaited her next words. The prosecution rose. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor began, his voice steady but edged with excitement. "With the court's permission, I would like to explore the child's connection to the canine. What she revealed may hold significant relevance to this case." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a 3-year-old child. Her words are unreliable and should not be given weight in these proceedings. To allow such testimony risks undermining the entire judicial process." The judge regarded him coolly. "Objection noted. However," he leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "The child identified the canine by a name known only to its handlers. That is not mere coincidence. This court cannot ignore it." The defense attorney opened his mouth to protest further, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "The prosecution may proceed." A hush fell. The prosecutor approached the gallery slowly, his expression softened to avoid frightening the girl. He crouched down to her level, speaking gently. "Sweetheart, can you tell us again what you said to the dog earlier?" The girl blinked, tilting her head as if the answer were obvious. "I said, 'Max, sit,' because that's his name." She pointed to the German shepherd, who perked his ears at the sound, wagging his tail. "And how do you know his name is Max?" The prosecutor asked carefully. "Because I played with him," the girl said simply. "At the house. He barked when the bad man shouted, but he didn't bite me. He was nice." The gallery gasped as one. The prosecutor's heart pounded, though he kept his tone calm. "The bad man, sweetheart? Can you tell us who that was?" The child lifted her small hand and without hesitation pointed toward the defense table. "Him." The word sliced through the air like a blade. The defendant shifted violently in his seat, his attorney gripping his arm as though to anchor him. His face burned red, sweat trickling down his temples. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel slammed. "Order! Order in the court!" But the whispers wouldn't be contained. The jurors exchanged glances, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. Reporters scribbled like wildfire. The prosecutor's voice was gentle but insistent. "Sweetheart, you're very brave. Can you tell us more about what happened with Max at the house?" The girl frowned, her small brows knitting together as she tried to recall. "It was loud. Mommy was crying. He, again," she pointed at the defendant, "was yelling. Then Max barked and pulled on the rope. He wanted me to hide." "Hide? Where?" the prosecutor asked softly. "In the closet," she whispered. "With my bunny." The courtroom froze. The officer holding Max tightened his grip on the leash, his chest heaving as the girl's words triggered memories. He remembered. That night vividly, the night the K-9 unit had been dispatched to the defendant's residence. They'd arrived too late to catch him inside, but neighbors had reported screams, barking, and chaos. They had found the girl and her mother afterward, shaken but alive. Still, details had been scarce. Now, from the innocent mouth of a child, those details poured out unfiltered. The defense attorney sprang up again. "Your Honor, I must object. This is hearsay, and this child is far too young to comprehend the implications of her words." But the judge held up a hand. "Objection. Overruled. The child's statements are consistent with evidence previously introduced. The court will hear her." The defense attorney slumped back, defeated. The prosecutor pressed on. "And Max? What did he do after you hid?" The little girl hugged her bunny tighter, her eyes darting toward the shepherd as though seeking reassurance. "He barked at the bad man. He tried to keep him away from Mommy. He was very brave." Max let out a soft whine, as if affirming her memory. The room sat spellbound. The innocence of her testimony, combined with the unmistakable reaction of the dog, left little room for doubt. The child wasn't fabricating. She was recalling. The prosecutor stood slowly, his eyes sweeping across the jurors. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the words of a child too young to be coached in legal strategy, too innocent to invent such detail. She recognized this K9, not because someone told her his name, but because she lived it. She was there. She saw. She heard. And she remembers. The defense attorney scrambled, desperation leaking into his voice. This is outrageous. We cannot convict a man based on the imagination of a toddler. But the jurors' faces told another story. Their skepticism had evaporated, replaced with a dawning conviction. The defendant's own reaction, his sweat, his twitching hands, his refusal to meet the child's gaze, was louder than any denial. The judge struck his gavel once more. The child's words will be entered into the record. The defendant buried his face in his hands. The courtroom, though ordered to silence, pulsed with electricity. Something irreversible had shifted. As the child leaned against her mother, already distracted by the floppy ears of her stuffed bunny, the German shepherd lowered his head, letting out a soft sigh. To him, justice wasn't measured in verdicts or evidence. Justice was the bond between him and the little girl, the bond that had led her to remember his name, and through that memory, reveal the truth. And though she was only 3 years old, her words had done what seasoned investigators and attorneys had struggled to achieve. She had connected the dots. She had tied the dog, the man, and the night of terror together in one simple, unshakable revelation. The connection was revealed, and nothing in the courtroom would ever be the same again. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from disbelief to an almost electric anticipation. The jurors sat stiff in their seats, eyes locked forward, their notebooks brimming with fresh scribbles. For days, the trial had trudged along with dry witness statements and forensic jargon, but now a spark had ignited. That spark came not from seasoned lawyers or polished testimonies, but from a 3-year-old child and a dog who wagged his tail at the sound of his old name. The judge leaned back, adjusting his glasses with deliberate calm, though his eyes betrayed unease. He knew the balance of the trial had tipped. The defense looked battered, their client visibly shaken, and the prosecution carried a newfound vigor. But there was much more that needed to be revealed. Prosecution may continue, the judge said, his tone firm. The prosecutor, a tall man with lines etched deep from years of courtroom battles, rose again. His voice softened, careful not to overwhelm the child. Sweetheart, you said Max barked when the bad man yelled. Do you remember what the bad man was yelling? The little girl tilted her head, clutching her stuffed bunny tighter. He said Mommy couldn't leave. He said he'd hurt her if she tried. A collective intake of breath filled the room. The mother, sitting beside her, closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the wooden pew. The prosecutor nodded gently. And where were you when he said those things? In the hallway, the child whispered. Max was with me. He pulled my arm, like he wanted me to run. She tugged on her bunny's ear, mimicking the motion. The canine shifted, ears pricked. His handler placed a calming hand on his head, but the shepherd's eyes never left the little girl. The defense attorney shot up. Your Honor, I must object. Again, we cannot allow a toddler's fragmented memory to serve as key evidence. This is highly prejudicial. But the judge shook his head. The objection is overruled. Her words are consistent with previous testimony and with the responding officer's reports of that night. His gaze swept toward the defense table. You'd do better preparing your rebuttal than wasting this court's time. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his face flushed. His client glared at him, fury simmering in his eyes. The prosecutor continued carefully. Sweetheart, you said Max wanted you to hide. Did you hide? Yes, she said, her voice firmer now, as if gaining confidence. I hid in the closet. Mommy told me to be quiet. But I could hear Max barking and the man shouting. Then I heard a big bang. The room froze. The jurors stiffened, pens pausing mid-stroke. The mother gasped audibly, her body trembling. Even the officer with the K9 drew in a sharp breath. The prosecutor leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Sweetheart, can you tell us what the bang sounded like? The girl's eyes grew wide. She slapped her tiny hands together once, hard, making several jurors flinch. Like that, she said. Like the door breaking. Max ran to the man. He was loud. Then I heard Mommy scream. The mother buried her face in her hands, her quiet sobs muffled by her palms. The prosecutor rose slowly, turning toward the jurors. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the account of a child unprompted, uncoached who remembers the night better than any of us ever could. She recalls violence, threats, and the very moment this K9 attempted to intervene. The defense attorney shot up again, his desperation mounting. This is emotional manipulation, Your Honor. She's 3 years old. She doesn't understand what she's saying. The judge's gavel slammed. Sit down, counselor. The child's testimony is admissible, and her clarity speaks for itself. The defendant shifted violently, his chair scraping against the floor. His jaw clenched, muscles twitching as if restraining an outburst. Sweat rolled down his temples. He knew the narrative was slipping beyond his control, unraveling thread by thread. The prosecutor approached the officer and his K9. Officer. Daniels, you were part of the responding unit the night in question? Yes, the officer said firmly. Max and I were deployed to the residence. Did Max attempt to breach the property? The officer nodded. Yes. He lunged at the door, barking furiously. When we entered, it was chaos. Broken furniture, shattered glass. The child and mother were later found shaken but alive. And the defendant? Gone. He fled before we breached. The prosecutor paced slowly, turning toward the jurors again. You've just heard confirmation from both the child and law enforcement that Max the K9 was present that night, protecting this little girl and her mother. She remembered his name not by chance, but because of that night, because he saved her. Max whined softly, sensing the emotion in the room. The little girl smiled faintly, waving at him. He wagged his tail, straining against the leash, desperate to close the distance. The judge leaned forward, his expression grave. Counselor, proceed to your next line of questioning. The prosecutor nodded. He looked at the mother. Ma'am, with the court's permission, may we ask you to verify what your daughter has shared? The mother wiped her tears, her voice trembling but resolute. It's true, Your Honor. That night, she pointed at the defendant. He came home drunk, angry. I tried to protect my daughter, but he pushed me. Max barked. He distracted him long enough for me to shove my daughter into the closet. I thought we wouldn't make it out alive. Her words hung heavy each. One a stone dropping into water, rippling outward. The defense attorney jumped again. This is hearsay compounded by trauma. The judge silenced him with another strike of the gavel. Enough. His voice was sharp. The mother's corroboration stands. The jurors sat stunned, their faces grave. One woman wiped a tear discreetly. Another man scribbled notes furiously, his jaw clenched. The prosecutor spoke again, his tone slow, deliberate. The truth has been uncovered here not through technicalities, not through speculation, but through the voices of those who lived it. A 3-year-old child, her mother, and a loyal K9 who refuses to forget. The defense attorney buried his face in his hands. The defendant sat rigid, eyes wild, his composure shattering piece by piece. The judge's gavel struck once more. The child's testimony, corroborated by her mother and the responding officer, will remain part of this record. We will recess for the day and reconvene tomorrow to continue proceedings. A courtroom buzzed as people rose to leave. Reporters bolted for the doors, already rehearsing their headlines. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances, whispering quietly as bailiffs escorted them out. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, can Max come sit with me tomorrow?" She asked innocently, her voice carrying despite the chaos. Max barked once, sharply, his tail wagging furiously. The room stilled again, every head turning toward the dog. The judge, caught off guard, cracked the faintest smile. "Perhaps," he said softly, "perhaps he just might." And as the courtroom emptied, one truth remained uncheckable. Innocence had spoken, loyalty had barked, and the darkness of that night had finally begun to lift. The truth was no longer hidden. It had been uncovered by the unlikeliest of witnesses. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to the brim. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and people even stood along the walls, straining to catch every word. Reporters had arrived early, their cameras ready, pens eager to record history. The case had shifted overnight from a quiet trial into a storm that captured headlines. Nationwide, toddler identifies police dog, points at defendant. The defendant shuffled into the room with a heavy scowl, his shackled ankles clinking. Faintly, his once confident demeanor had withered into agitation. He avoided eye contact with the jurors, who now watched him not as a man wrongfully accused, but as someone cornered by the most unlikely of witnesses, a child and a dog. The little girl entered with her mother, holding her stuffed bunny in one hand, her tiny fingers curled around her mother's in the other. She looked cheerful, oblivious to the tension her words had set loose. Max, the German shepherd, perked up the moment he saw her, tail thumping the floor in rhythmic excitement. His handler muttered a quiet command, but the bond between child and dog was undeniable. The judge took his seat, his gavel striking once. Court is now in session. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. Yesterday's revelations had changed the course of this trial, and now he, too, was waiting to see where the truth would lead. The prosecution rose, straight-backed and composed. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began. "We've heard the voices of a child, her mother, and law enforcement. Today, we bring clarity. Today, we strip away the remaining layers of deception." He turned toward the gallery where the child sat. "With the court's permission, I'd like to ask a few more questions." The judge nodded, though his expression softened as his gaze flicked toward the little girl. "Proceed, but keep it brief." The prosecutor crouched again, careful to meet her eyes without intimidation. "Sweetheart, yesterday you told us that Max barked when the bad man shouted. Do you remember what happened after?" The girl hugged her bunny tightly. Max ran to him. He pulled on his arm. "Mommy told me to stay quiet, but I peeked." "And what did you see when you peeked?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "I saw the bad man hit Mommy," the girl said in her small, trembling voice. Max barked louder. He didn't let go. Gasps broke out in the gallery. Jurors' faces hardened. The defendant shifted angrily, tugging at his cuffs. The prosecutor nodded solemnly. "Thank you. That's very brave." He stood and faced the jurors. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've now heard it confirmed. Violence witnessed by a child, interrupted only by the courage of this K9. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. Testimony of a toddler." "Sit down, counselor," the judge thundered, his gavel cracking against wood. "I warned you yesterday. Her testimony stands." The defense attorney slumped, defeated. His client hissed something under his breath, but the attorney waved him off, sweat dripping at his temples. The prosecutor pressed forward. "Officer Daniels, when you and Max entered the property that night, what did you observe?" The officer stood tall. "Your Honor," Max led the charge. He pulled toward the defendant, even through the chaos. "We recovered broken furniture and evidence of physical struggle. The child and her mother were found hiding, exactly as the little girl described." "And Max's reaction to the child yesterday?" the prosecutor asked. The officer's voice softened. "Immediate recognition. Loyalty. Dogs don't lie, Your Honor. He remembered her. She remembered him. That's why she called him by his old name." The jurors nodded subtly, their pens scratching across notepads. The judge, normally stoic, shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened, and he removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. For a moment, the stern facade cracked, revealing the man beneath the man who had children of his own, who could not escape the image of a little girl hiding in a closet with her stuffed bunny, listening to her mother's screams. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge said, his voice unusually husky, "you will consider all evidence presented, including the testimony given by this child." He glanced briefly at the girl, who was now whispering something to her bunny. "This court is not blind to innocence, nor will it ignore truth spoken plainly." The defense attorney scrambled, trying to salvage what remained. He called his client to the stand, hoping to humanize him. But when the defendant sat before the jurors, his temper betrayed him. His answers were curt, evasive. When asked about that night, he muttered contradictions, denying details that had already been confirmed. At one point, the prosecutor asked, sharply, "So you claim you are not in the house that night?" The defendant sneered. "I wasn't. They're lying." The prosecutor leaned in. "Then explain why a 3-year-old child knows the old name of a canine you encountered that night, why she points at you without hesitation." The defendant's face twisted, rage flashing in his eyes. "She's just a stupid kid. She doesn't know anything," he shouted, slamming his fist on the witness stand. The outburst sent a shockwave through the courtroom. The little girl whimpered and buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Max barked once, sharp and commanding, pulling hard on his leash as if to protect her all over again. The bailiff surged forward, steadying the defendant as the judge roared, "Order! Order!" His gavel slammed repeatedly, echoing like thunder. The jury stared in stunned silence, their faces etched with horror. The prosecutor, calm even in the chaos, turned slowly toward the jurors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly, "you just saw for yourselves the temperament of this man. You saw it in his rage, his aggression, his contempt. Now imagine that rage directed at a defenseless woman and her child. Imagine it, and then remember the words of that little girl." Max barked when the bad man yelled. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The judge's expression was grim. "We will recess until tomorrow for closing arguments. This session is adjourned." The gavel cracked one final time. As people filed out, reporters rushed to phones and cameras. Jurors avoided looking at the defendant, their minds already weighing the inevitable. The defendant himself slumped in his chair, face flushed with fury, his attorney whispering frantically in his ear. But in the gallery, the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered softly. Max barked again. "He still remembers." The German shepherd wagged his tail, ears perked, his gaze locked on her. To him, nothing had changed. He was still her protector. He had been then, and he was now. And the courtroom, still echoing with the sound of his bark, would never forget it. The final day of the trial arrived like a storm. By dawn, a crowd had already gathered outside the courthouse neighbors. Reporters, strangers who had followed every word in the news. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of anticipation and dread. Everyone knew the jury's decision today would define not just the fate of one man, but the lasting meaning of a little girl's words and a dog's loyalty. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers. The jurors filed in quietly, their faces grave, revealing nothing. The defendant sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles white, lips pressed thin. His once arrogant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, hollow stare. His attorney muttered something low, but the man didn't respond. His eyes darted toward the jury box, as if searching for some last-minute salvation. The mother and child sat in the gallery, close to the aisle. The little girl swung her legs, her stuffed bunny tucked firmly in her arms. She didn't understand. The weight of the day, not fully. To her, it was another chance to see Max. And sure enough, when the German Shepherd entered with Officer Daniels, her eyes lit up. Max's tail thumped against the floor. His ears perked the moment he spotted her. The judge entered and struck his gavel. Court is now in session. We are here to hear closing arguments before the jury deliberates. His voice was steady, though everyone could feel the heaviness pressing on his words. The prosecution stood, buttoning his jacket, his expression calm but resolute. He walked to the center of the courtroom, his eyes sweeping across the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have heard every piece of evidence. We have heard from officers, from experts, and from witnesses. But above all, we heard from the only ones who were truly there that night. A mother, her child, and the canine who saved them. What they told us was not rehearsed. It was not coached. It was truth, spoken in the simplest, clearest way." He paused, letting the silence breathe. That child pointed at the defendant and said the words that cut through every lie. "Bad man." She identified Max as her protector, remembered his name, and recalled what he did when this man hurt her mother. Even in her innocence, she told us everything we needed to know. The prosecutor's tone sharpened. "And when the defendant took the stand, what did you see? Not a man falsely accused. Not a man wronged. You saw his temper. You saw his violence spill out right here in this courtroom. His rage was not hypothetical, it was on display." He turned toward the defendant, whose face flushed with anger again. Then he looked back at the jury. "Your duty is clear. Deliver justice. Not just for the mother who suffered. Not just for the officers who risked their lives. But for that little girl who had the courage to speak when it mattered most. She deserves to grow up knowing that her words mattered, that her truth was enough." He stepped back, his expression solemn. "We ask you, find the defendant guilty." The courtroom was utterly still. Then, the defense attorney rose, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. His voice lacked the fire it once carried. "Ladies and gentlemen, yes, you saw anger in my client, but anger does not equal guilt. Children are impressionable. Memories can be flawed. Do not let emotion guide your decision. Look to the facts, not to the bark of a dog or the words of a toddler. That is not justice, it is theater." His words fell flat, echoing in the silence. Even he seemed unconvinced. The judge gave his instructions to the jury and dismissed them to deliberate. As the jurors filed out, the room erupted into a low hum of conversation. The mother held her daughter close, whispering reassurances. Max lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, though his golden eyes remained alert, as if he too was waiting for judgment. Hours passed. The crowd outside grew restless, news outlets broadcasting live updates. Inside, the air felt heavy, time stretching unbearably. The defendant shifted constantly in his chair, muttering curses. His attorney sat pale and sweating, unable to mask his dread. Finally, the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise for the jury. The room fell silent. The jurors returned, faces unreadable. They settled into their seats, the foreperson clutching a folded paper. The judge looked down at them. Have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, the foreperson replied. The paper was handed to the judge, who scanned it briefly. Before returning it, please read the verdict. The foreperson stood, clearing his throat. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of finality. In the matter of the charges brought against the defendant, we, the jury, find the defendant. The entire room seemed to lean forward. Guilty on all counts. The words struck like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted gasps, muffled sobs, even applause quickly hushed by the bailiffs. The defendant lurched to his feet, shouting, "This is a lie. She's just a kid." But his voice was drowned out by the gavel slamming. "Order! Order in the court!" The judge bellowed. He fixed his gaze on the defendant, his voice like stone. "You had your chance to speak. The jury has spoken. You are guilty, and this court accepts their verdict." The defendant struggled, but the bailiffs restrained him. His curses echoed. Down the hall as he was dragged away, his fate sealed. The little girl clapped her hands, not fully understanding, but sensing relief in the room. "Mommy, is the bad man gone?" she whispered. Her mother nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, sweetheart. He's gone." The girl leaned down toward Max, patting his head with her tiny hand. "We did it, Max. You barked, and I told." The dog wagged his tail, leaning into her touch, his soft eyes never leaving hers. To him, it wasn't about verdicts or trials. It was about loyalty protecting her then, and reassuring her now. The judge removed his glasses, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard it. "Let it be known that justice is served. This case will stand as a reminder that truth, even from the smallest voice, carries weight in this court. This session is adjourned." A final crack of the gavel resounded like the closing of a chapter. As the crowd spilled out into the sunlight, reporters clamored for interviews, cameras flashing. But the mother shielded her daughter, whispering, "Not today. Today is ours." They walked down the courthouse steps slowly, Max trotting faithfully beside them. The child skipped once, humming softly, her stuffed bunny swinging in her hand. For her, the world had shifted lighter, safer, freer. The officer walking beside them bent down and scratched Max's ear. "Good job, partner. You did more than any of us today." And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the courthouse, the story of a child, a dog, and the two simple words that toppled lies spread far and wide. But for the little girl, none of that mattered. She looked up at her mother, her voice sweet and certain. "Mommy," she said, smiling brightly, "Max is my hero." And in that moment, the world finally felt right again.